Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson School. My name is Gary Bass. I'm a professor here. It's my pleasure to introduce Peter Baker, who is the Chief White House Correspondent of the New York Times and a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. This doesn't really capture who Peter actually is, which is that Peter is the best White House reporter in the country. He is the smartest, he is the most experienced, he is the most inquisitive, he is the most historically informed. Thank you. That's it. In an era of, right, thank you for the emoluments.
Oh, God. Who knew that would be a joke?
Yeah, that gets up. Anyway, dark days. And he'll deny all of this because he is, in fact, the nicest, which would have worked better before the bribe. He has written for the New York Times since 2008. Before that, he spent 20 years at the Washington Post, where he covered the presidencies of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, and he's now covering President Trump. He was the Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post, covering Vladimir Putin, but I repeat myself. And covered the second Chechnya war, the Beslan hostage crisis, and the slow collapse of Russian democracy. He's also reported from the front lines of Afghanistan. Peter and I, by the way, are old friends, which is why I'm going to give the money back. I'll think about it. So I was deeply unhappy about his time in Afghanistan. He was the first American reporter in the North in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. He's also reported from Iraq, where, among other things, he invaded alongside the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. He's going to be talking tonight about his wonderful new book about called Obama, The Call of History, which he'll be signing, which is for sale outside, and Peter will be signing them. He may also slip you $40. He previously wrote 3 outstanding books. Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House, which was one of the New York Times' 10 best books of the year. With his wife, Susan Glasser, another great journalist, he wrote Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution, which the Washington Post named as one of its best books of the year, and The Breach, Inside the Impeachment and Trial of William Jefferson Clinton. For his coverage of Bush, he won the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency, and for his coverage of Obama, the Aldo Beckman Memorial Award for White House coverage. Peter's going to speak, and then we will take questions. I remind you that the sort of standard thing that we do in the Wilson School is that Princeton students get priority first, so if students could come to the microphones first, then we will accommodate you. I want to say one last thing, is that this is an unusual political moment where American democratic institutions are being tested by a radical presidency. But institutions are made up of individuals who, and what an institution rests on is the professionalism and commitment of the people within those institutions. And there, despite unprecedented heat from the White House, Peter, who's stood up to heat from 3 presidents previously, is doing his job. He would be annoyed if I praised him for that because he thinks of it simply as doing his job. But he's a person of honesty and integrity and courage, and it's our honor to have him with us tonight. So thank you very much. Peter.
I'm buying Gary dinner after this. Wilson School. Thank you guys very much for coming. I'm really excited to be here. I had the honor of being in the same room 4 years ago when a book I wrote about Bush and Cheney came out, and you all were very generous to invite me for that. I'm delighted to be back here tonight. This book is a little different, partly because it's my favorite kind of book. It's full of pictures. So Gary does these learned, scholarly, important books of great magnitude and revelatory, and they tell us about things we didn't know anything about. I've got pictures. So when you go take a look at it, you'll see that it's a remarkable production that I had very little to do with. The parts of the book that are amazing are the images of an 8-year presidency that was full of very memorable moments, and it's actually fun to look through it and remember remember some of them. Some of them would be better left forgotten, perhaps. But thanks so much to Princeton and Elizabeth, wherever she's gone, and the Wilson School for having me here. I'm not going to talk very long. My professors in college would find it stunning that I'm actually standing in front of you giving a lecture tonight. So I think it would be better we'll have a conversation in a few minutes. But I'll tell you a little bit about this book and why I wrote it, and then we can go from there. The reason I wanted to write this book was to try to tackle a question that has actually been perplexing the country now for a while, which is, who is Barack Obama? More than almost any president I think we've had in the modern era, this question is central to his presidency, is that we don't really yet, even today, know or understand him in a real way. And it's okay, because I don't think he does either. I mean, the thing that's really interesting about Obama is that he got his first appearance on the national stage with a book that was in fact all about trying to figure out who the heck he was, right? Dreams from My Father was a book of self-discovery. It was a book of introspection. It was a book of exploration, which we don't see very often in American presidents in a public way, right? They present an image to us of what they want us to see. We, the reporters, try our best to get behind the image and tell you what's really going on. Very rarely do you have a person who reaches the highest levels of American politics who is openly, overtly introspective and reflective about who they are as a person and how they fit into the society that they are now, in fact, governing. And with Obama, we saw this again and again and again. That's why I think he's such a fascinating subject. As fascinated as we are by today's leadership in Washington, Obama, I think, will still go down in history as one of our more fascinating and perplexing of presidents. I mean, think about it. Think about how to compare him to other presidents. We like to compare our presidents, right? Aha, so-and-so is like Truman, so-and-so is like Lincoln, so-and-so is like, James Buchanan. And with Obama, and again and again, and he encouraged this, right? He came to office on the same route to Washington that Lincoln had taken to come to Washington. He put his hand on the same Bible that Lincoln had put his hand on when he took the oath of office. He created a cabinet that he openly called a team of rivals after Doris Kearns Goodwin's great book about Lincoln and his team. And he wanted to associate himself with Lincoln. But that wasn't the only president we would compare him to. At that time, in the beginning of his presidency, there were all these different comparisons. The New Yorker put him on the cover with a powdered wig and said he was a new George Washington, right? And Time magazine had him like a Franklin D. Roosevelt with a kind of, the pince-nez glasses and the cigarette holder. And a lot of Americans sort of saw him as kind of the new John F. Kennedy with an African-American Camelot, a cool, younger president of a new generation with a young, hip family. Even when things started to go wrong, we were looking for comparisons. We were looking how to try to fit him into a prism that we could understand. When he started sending more troops to Afghanistan, people said, well, maybe he's like Lyndon Johnson. Or when he was trying to transform America, some people compared him to Ronald Reagan in a different ideological sense, but the sense of somebody who would be transformative. When things started going wrong and his critics started going after him for various scandals, real and perceived, some of them compared him to Richard Nixon. Or when he expanded the drones over Pakistan and adopted a lot of the counterterrorism policies that he had inherited, he was called another George W. Bush. When things didn't go well in Syria or in other foreign policy places, people called him another Jimmy Carter. At one point, I talked to an aide of his, and the guy said, sometimes I think the only president we haven't been compared to is Franklin Pierce. Which is good, because he was a drunk. So it's true. My favorite quote in American presidential history is Franklin Pierce. When he left the White House, he said, what else is there to do but drink? It's true. So, Obama himself put his finger on this at one point in 2008. He says, look, I don't look like all the presidents on the dollar bills, right? For one thing, there's an obvious reason. He was the first African-American president we had, and he knew that would be the first line in his obituary. He understood that. That was such a remarkable event in American history, a country that had been struggling with the legacy of slavery for 200 years, that his election by itself, with having done nothing else other than to take the oath, would by itself be the definition of his place in history. But he didn't want that to be the only thing he was remembered for. He wanted to be remembered as a president who did things. He wanted to be an activist president. He wanted to create a new society, He called it a new foundation, right? That was his version of the New Deal or the Square Deal or the Great Society. It didn't really stick, the new foundation. How many people use that today? Yeah, no, nobody uses that. But he managed at the same time to both captivate us as a country and confuse us as a country. Because he hadn't spent a lot of time in our public consciousness before he became president. So a lot of people put in him what they wanted to see. He was at once the avatar of a new generation of activist government, a progressive champion of the idea that the Democrats hadn't really succeeded in promoting in a long, long time in their view, and he was going to be the person who could reinvent, liberalism for the new era. Or he was going to be the post-partisan bridge builder who could bring us together. We're not the red America, we're not the blue America, we're the United States of America, right? And ultimately, of course, these two things are clashing. These two things are very hard to be. It's hard to be a champion of ideological change and a bipartisan bridge builder at the same time. And we had invested in him what we wanted to see. Some of us wanted to see that, some of us wanted to see this. And he himself said, I'm like a Rorschach test. Everybody sees in me what they want to see. And that was true. And, for those of us who covered him, he was kind of opaque too, I have to say. He's not your ordinary politician. When he came back to the back of Air Force One, he wasn't sitting there clapping on your shoulder and asking how the kids were. He didn't give you a nickname the way George W. Bush would give you a nickname. And he didn't tell you funny stories from the Ozarks the way Bill Clinton would tell you. My first Air Force One flight with Bill Clinton, he told this very funny and very dirty story. And his voice got, thicker and thicker Southern accent as he went along, and it was just, but very real, right? And Joe Biden, his own vice president, was the same, very outgoing, engaging, I'm going to grip you by the shoulders kind of politician. That's not Obama. This is not who he is. He's the first introvert, I think, we've had as president, going back many years, probably to Jimmy Carter. And in the modern era, that's a really interesting challenge, right? Whereas Bill Clinton, you could put him in a rope line and he would just go for hours until they dragged him away. And he would be charged up afterwards. And even Bush, while not as avaricious in that sense as Clinton, would enjoy a good crowd. With Obama, his aides would actually give him a few minutes after a scheduled event because they knew he needed to recharge his batteries. He needed to get his energy back. It drained him rather than charged him up because, like many of us, he was not a outgoing person. He's a reserved person. My colleague Maureen Dowd famously called him Mr. Spock, right? Now, of course, what we forget is that Mr. Spock was half Vulcan. He was also half human, and there is this human side to Barack Obama that's kind of interesting. I mean, he's a trash talker on the basketball court. His people who worked for him and played him in the back would just tell these outrageous stories about him knocking him to the ground and come on, man, you got to do better than that. Like, he would really be very aggressive in a way that we didn't see him in a political sense often. He loved Sports Center. He loved golf, obviously. He stayed up late watching ESPN. He had this range of music on his iPad that was eclectic and interesting, and he brought cultural music to the White House, the kind of which we hadn't really seen in many years. He had a lot of interest. He's a very interesting person. And he was disciplined, right? Family man, got home, tried to make it home anyway, to dinner for 6:30 every night if he could with his daughters when he was in town. Helps to live above the store, but helps to go to the daughter's basketball game with a 30-car motorcade. But it mattered to him, and it mattered, I think, to the country that we saw a family that seemed healthy and functional and loving and real at a time when we don't always see that in our public figures. He was so disciplined. I remember my colleague Mike Scheer actually wrote this great story about how at night after his wife and daughters would go to bed, he would sit there and read his briefing books or watch ESPN, and he would eat almonds. That was the one thing he allowed himself, almonds. 7 of them. Not 6, not 8, but 7. Now, he later denied that. That was a joke that his chef and his wife had come up with. They're the ones who came up with the only 7, and Barack Obama denied it publicly. But it tells you something about the guy that he felt the need to deny it publicly. But he could be emotional too. I always remember seeing him after Sandy Hook, the terrible school shooting in Connecticut after his reelection, and he was streaming tears on his face, as any of us would, but we don't often see in our president. He choked up. He couldn't continue the speech he was giving. He literally stopped for 8 seconds, 10 seconds, 12 seconds. And what that doesn't sound very long, just play it out in your mind and think of complete silence for 8 or 10, 12 seconds when you're watching a president. That's very unheard of. So he had a real side to him that we often missed, that I think animated his desire to do what he was going to do for the country. But we saw him again through our own lens, not his lens. We saw him as we wanted to see him or we didn't want to see him. To conservatives, he was a socialist, right? He was the second coming of Karl Marx or Bernie Sanders or what have you. He was going to take over our healthcare system, and he was taxing us too much, and he was putting too many regulations on, and he was dividing the country, in some people's view, by attacking police officers. I don't think he really attacked police officers, but I think there was a sense on the part of at least some people out there that he wasn't as supportive of them as they had wished he would be. And then the flip side of that, of course, are his own supporters, who for much of his presidency, not at the end, but through much of his presidency were disappointed with him on the left. People who felt like he didn't live up to the promise that he had made, that he had promised so much in his own campaign. Remember, this is the moment when the oceans will begin to recede. This is the moment we will heal our planet. Not small promises to make as a politician, and awfully hard to keep. And people on the left found his compromises to be at times frustrating and dispiriting. Why didn't you put a public option in your health care plan? Why did you keep doing those drone strikes that George W. Bush left behind? Why is it that you have not gone after the Republicans more on immigration or what have you? And so he was this figure where he could be at the same time both too left and too right as far as much of the country goes. Now, in some ways, that tells us about ourselves as much as anything else, right? We are, at this moment, a polarized country. It says something that I wrote about this morning, that the last 4 or 5 presidents each came into office promising to bring us together and failed, right? George H.W. Bush promised a kinder, gentler nation. Bill Clinton said he was going to be the repairer of the breach. George W. Bush said he was going to be a uniter and not a divider. And Barack Obama was going to get rid of those red state, blue state divisions and bring us together. And each of them, I think, in their own way tried and failed. And we look at our politicians and we blame them for this these days, right? How come you're dividing us up? And there's something to be said for that. Our politicians do have responsibility for that. But we also ought to make sure we look at the mirror and understand why it is that we are ourselves so divided. And it's an interesting dynamic that's happening in this country. We are increasingly dividing ourselves. We are segregating ourselves as much along political and ideological lines as we were once along racial and ethnic lines. We are moving to live next to people who agree with us. There is actually a statistical breakpoint, which is very fascinating. If you live in a place with 800 people or more per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Democrat. If you live in a place with fewer than 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be Republican. And it's not just physical. We do this, by the way, 98% of the densest counties in America, Barack Obama won in 2012, and 98% of the least dense counties in America, Mitt Romney won in 2012. We have divided ourselves to a certain extent. That's physical. It's also metaphorical. It's also in the intellectual space. If we are liberal, we want to watch MSNBC. If we're conservative, we want to watch Fox. We read Huffington Post to get a good view on climate change. We read the Daily Caller to find out about the Benghazi scandal, what have you. We are dividing ourselves up. When I was young, when many of you were young, not you, college students, there were 3 networks, right? 3 networks and maybe a handful of newspapers, and that was where you got your information from. And we had big debates back then, too. It's not new that America is divided over issues. What's new is we don't start from the same starting point. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, we had the same basic fact set from which we had our arguments. Today, people live in their own factual worlds that are completely and radically different. So no wonder we don't get along so well if we don't even live in the same understanding of our own country. And that's the environment in which Barack Obama was trying to govern, the environment in which George W. Bush tried to govern, and the environment in which Donald Trump today is governing. Now, you can make the argument that Donald Trump may actually be a better fit for this moment than his predecessors, because he himself is, in fact, at heart, a divider, not a uniter. He didn't promise to repair the breach or to bring us together. He's not a shining city on a hill kind of guy. And he reflects our own grievances, our own sense of anger, our own sense that the country has gotten away from us. Not everybody, obviously, we're talking about the people who admire him the most. And when he gets out there, as he did this weekend, and talks about the NFL and how it's outrageous that they're kneeling and so forth, there's a part of the country that says, you tell them, all right, finally we're going to take on these entitled elites. Somebody's going to finally say it. It's not what presidents have done traditionally. Most presidents, they all played a division at some point. It's how you get elected. But they at least, once they get in the White House, feel some obligation to the notion that they are supposed to bring us together. This is a moment in our country where they have not, even when they have tried, they have found it very difficult. And that was, again, coming back to Obama, is the difficulty he challenged. At one point in his at no point during his 8 years in office did a majority of Americans think we were on the right track. Not one month. They asked this question every month at polls. Not one time did 51% of Americans think we were on the right track. In fact, at one point, only 11% during his presidency, only 11% of Americans thought we were on the wrong track, or on the right track. And that went back to during Bush. It didn't start under Obama. And it's been more or less true ever since. To this day, we are still living about a 15-year cycle of believing that our country is somehow really, really screwed up. And so, you have this guy coming into power who had not been a politician for very long. He'd been at 2 years at the national level before he began to run for president. And the challenges he confronted were huge. The economy was in a spiral. It seemed to be we were going to another Great Depression. We were in 2 wars overseas. We still had a big terrorist threat. We had the issues like illegal immigration and the deficit and the debt. What were we going to do? And it became so overwhelming that every problem was so monstrous. The old adage, and it's true for every president, is the easy questions don't get to the president's desk. Only the 51-49 questions. Because if it's an 80-20 question or a 90-10 question, the staff will have dealt with it long before it gets to the Oval Office. So when you're president, all the decisions you make, every single one, is a hard one. And it got to the point with Obama that he and his first chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, even kind of had a joke that they were just going to give up and move to Hawaii and open back. And they would have one size, medium, and one color, white. And so you'd have these meetings where they'd be going over some intractable, terrible problem, and they would just kind of look at each other and say, white. And the other one would say, medium. No good options, right? So that's, it took a toll. Obviously, the president grew grayer, we saw, over 8 years. I think he became more jaundiced about Washington. He probably tried less in terms of reaching across the aisle. He decided the other side wasn't serious about it, therefore he wasn't going to try anymore. And the result is that we now have moved into another presidency that is about, to some extent, a reaction to his. It is, in fact, to some extent, benefited from the backlash to his presidency. And because so many of the things he tried to do ultimately were based on executive power rather than legislation, they're easily reversed. I mean, if you live by executive orders, you're going to die by executive orders. If you you sign a piece of paper that says, I now hereby say 800,000 young immigrants who came to the country illegally because their parents brought them here can stay, and you don't get buy-in from Congress, that means the next guy can undo it just as easily as President Trump just did. And what's interesting about Obama's legacy is it seems today so unsettled. We don't yet know what it is. We don't really know, actually, for any president for 10, 20, 30 years. We're always reevaluating, rethinking, often evaluating up, frankly. Look at President George H.W. Bush today. His opinion, his standing among recent presidents has gone way up. People now appreciate his presidency in a way they might not have as much when he was in office. But President Obama seems singularly and powerfully unsettled with a successor who has made it his mission in life to undo so much of what he had done, right? We're seeing that right now, just today, with the health care vote, the latest effort to try to undo Obamacare. It now seems to have collapsed once again. The Republican Senator Susan Collins said she's going to vote against it. But President Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He announced that he's going to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. He has undone a lot of the environmental regulations that President Obama had tried putting in place through the EPA. He rolled back some of, not nearly as much as he pretended he did, some of the Cuba opening. He has threatened to undo the Iran nuclear deal. He has really made it a point of going after the things that were left behind by the previous president. Many presidents come in with a new point of view. I mean, obviously Ronald Reagan came in after Jimmy Carter, promising a new direction. Bill Clinton came in after George H.W. Bush, promising a new direction. But neither of them spent that much time actually undoing what the previous person had done. They each started moving forward on their own legacies, on their own goals and priorities. This President Trump just seems singularly focused on undoing President Obama's legacy. So we don't know yet where that's going to lead because we don't know how successful he'll be. The one thing that I think has provided comfort for some of President Obama's former aides when you talk to them is, thank God, is Trump, because he's not been very good at it. That may change, we don't know. And I think that for President Obama, it's a frustrating moment to see a lot of these things that he spent so much time trying to put together under attack. Now, why isn't he talking more about it? He's kind of gone underground, right? He's kind of staying out of public view. Well, I think that he has decided that there are some moments he will say something. He did say something about DACA, the immigrant program. He did say something about health care. But for the most part, he's decided he wants to stay out of the public realm because he thinks that that will only give President Trump an enemy, a foil, somebody to attack. And we know President Trump likes that. He likes to play off of somebody, right? He needs somebody to be us versus them, and President Obama doesn't want to give him that. Since President Trump doesn't have that, and the Democrats are pretty weak right now, that's why he tends to go after NFL players or the fake news media or anybody else he can think of to attack because he doesn't have the kind of opposition, including his own party. So President Obama right now is kind of in this mode where he's kind of sitting back, and we're back where we started. We're back to this point of figuring out who he is. He's sitting down to write a book now that will attempt to explain himself and his presidency. And what I'm really looking forward to as somebody who has spent the last 10 years, most of the last 10 years trying to understand him, is the hope that he will do what no president really has done before, which is to write an honest memoir, or at least a semi-honest memoir. I don't want to raise the bar too high, but it would be so interesting to see the first Barack Obama, the 30-something, however old he was when he wrote his post-law review memoir. I would love to see that writer tackle this presidency and tell us what he really thought, what he really experienced, what he really thinks about it. We don't have to agree with it, but it would be so much more interesting, especially from history's point of view, to take us inside his world, help us understand who he is, because that's something I think we would all benefit from. So I think from that, we're going to take some questions. Is that right?
Great. Thank you. So I invite you all to come down to the microphone. Students first, please. Let's get some.
Come on, somebody's got a question. We can be.
First off, thank you so much for making the time to be here. My name is Zach. I'm an MPA student here in the Wilson School. As a graduate student, I am in awe of your ability to write a book while having a full-time job. So, congrats.
Actually has pictures in it.
I read Ron Susskind's book, Confidence Men, over the summer, and one of the things I really took away from his treatment of the first 2 years of the Obama presidency was the extent to which the president's lack of management experience really got in the way of his ability to do what he wanted to do.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you could speak to how, in your time watching the president, understanding him, analyzing him, that's something you agree with, you disagree with, how that played out in the first 2 years, how he grew.
No, it's a great question. He, of course, had not been a manager of anything larger than a Senate office of, a couple dozen people until he ran for president. Now, he put together a pretty good campaign. That's essentially starting a Fortune 500 company from scratch in a period of, a year and a half. And that ran like clockwork. You have to give him credit. I don't think you've seen a major presidential campaign as flawless as his in 2008 in a long time. Hillary Clinton would be the first one to tell you that. And it probably had to be, right? To be the first African American to win the presidency out of nowhere with no base, with no, no history, no political organization. It had to be. But that did not make him a manager. It did not mean that he had executive experience. And I think he was learning on the job. And I think President Obama's a smart guy, and he knows he's a smart guy. And sometimes that's not necessarily a good thing, right? So I'll give you a good example. His sense of politics could be off. So he puts together a stimulus package, right? The economy's in crisis. He has to get a package done right away. There's no time to waste. He gets it done in 17 days. That's a pretty extraordinary thing. No president has ever passed $800 billion worth of spending in 17 days. Now, the Republicans would say that was the problem. But the actual problem was that he couldn't bring Republicans on board. Now, was that because they were inherently opposed to everything he did? Maybe. But one thing he did was he put together the package he thought they would like. So it had basically 1/3 aid to the states, basically 1/3 public works kind of spending, and basically 1/3 tax cuts, structured as he wanted them. And he said, well, look, you Republicans should like this. I've given you tax cuts. And they didn't like it. And he was stunned, like, why don't you like this? I don't understand. You should like this. And I think the problem for him was he's a smart enough guy, but he didn't understand that Republicans didn't want to be told what they wanted, right? And they didn't want to be simply handed what they were told they should want, and eat your peas, eat your broccoli, this is what you asked for. And he later told me in an interview, in fact, he said one of the mistakes he made was not letting the Republicans argue him into putting tax cuts in the bill, right? That's how politics works. The people have to have ownership over something, right? So the stimulus package passed without a single Republican vote. And from that point on, 17 days into his presidency, we began a pattern that he never got quite out of.
The ACA immediately comes to mind as another example of that. This is what you should like. And
yeah, exactly. I'm going with the heritage model of healthcare. Why don't you like this? Well, okay, it's great. Thank you for telling us what we should want. It just never worked that way. And he had a point. It was not the most liberal version of a healthcare plan. It was a more market-oriented plan. Same with cap and trade on climate, right? This is straight out of President George H.W. Bush's playbook on a previous environmental plan. The idea of a market-traded system that was, allowed industry to create a marketplace for itself. And he said, you should like this. And they didn't like it. They didn't like being lectured to in their view, fairly or not. That may not be fair, but that's the way some of them genuinely felt. Now, some of them were inalterably opposed to him no matter what. Fair enough. That's true. It's a polarized time. We talked about that. But he didn't have the experience at high-level politics to make him understand how to bring people in by giving them ownership over something that was important.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Ritter. I'm an undergraduate here. So you talked about earlier how someone's political affiliation is highly correlated with the population density of where they live. But we've recently seen a few very respected writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates, journalists like that, of that stature, argue that race was so central to the election. Do you see those two explanations as clashing, or do you see them as complementary, and how do you reconcile them?
No, I don't think those are clashing. I think race is, in fact, central to our population, to our voting patterns, to a lot of the things that are going on. But there were let me see if I can find it. I did have some numbers here. I think that race is definitely an issue. It can also be exaggerated, right? And so, the problem for Hillary Clinton wasn't that she didn't win the African-American vote. She did. She didn't turn them out in the numbers that President Obama did, right? She also didn't turn out younger people in the same numbers that President Obama did. And she didn't get a commensurate offsetting advantage among women voters, for instance, that you might have expected the first woman running as a major party nominee might have gotten. So there's no question that race is there. Obviously, you have to look at some of the campaign rhetoric. You have to look at President Trump's several-year effort to disqualify, in effect, President Obama by saying he wasn't even born in the country. You can't take that out of the equation. And I think it does go to our sense of where we live and who we talk to and where we come from that shapes our view of America today. And the problem for the media, I think, our problem in 2016 wasn't that we didn't give you tough coverage of both candidates, or that we did, the liberals say we did too much on the emails, and the conservatives say we're totally unfair to Trump and never gave him a chance. Our biggest issue, I think, if we do some soul searching, is that because we live, most of us who do this kind of reporting, in the Acela corridor, right, between Boston and Washington, we don't get out enough and live in the rest of the country. and we talk to people around us. And in Washington, we talk to more Republicans than, say, my friends in New York do, because it's much more of a bipartisan city, but they're different. They're establishment Republicans. They weren't the Trump Republicans. And so we didn't understand when all these Republicans were telling us in Washington, gosh, I can't vote for that guy. We didn't see that that was what he was actually running against. And some people did some very good reporting. I don't mean to in any way diminish it, but broadly speaking, our challenge, I think, is to make sure we're outside of the bubble that we live in.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. Thanks for being here. I'm a master's student. Your most recent comments, I think, actually segue well into this. I thought your comment about the ways that we're casting blame on political figures for polarization as opposed to looking at ourselves was interesting. So I wondered if you could reflect on the ways you think the media is both contributing to that and the role of the media in potentially shifting that dynamic.
Yeah, no, we do. We contribute to that. Absolutely, no question about it. So people, first of all, one thing I would say is when people accuse us of being biased, the bias that we have, are more reporters liberal or Democrat than Republican or conservative? Probably. The bias that mainstream media has is for conflict. We love conflict. Conflict sells, it's interesting, and it's important, by the way. Conflict is not just about selling newspapers, it actually goes to the heart of things. If everybody agrees on something in Washington, it's probably not doing very much, right? If a bill passes unanimously, it usually doesn't mean it's very important, because they don't agree on anything. So we are biased toward conflict, and because we are biased toward conflict, we tend to accentuate them. We tend to reward people who are the loudest. We tend to reward the people who are the most diametrically opposed. And if you watch the TV programs, some of which I'm on, they want somebody to be the hard right person and the hard left person. If you get two people who kind of like, yeah, I kind of agree with that person, I would do it a little differently, you don't see that on TV. It's not good TV. So we do have a role to play in this, absolutely. And I don't know exactly what the answer is to that. They don't do it because, they put on what people watch. So it's a unvirtuous cycle in which, we the media give people what they want, and therefore we don't give them what they don't want. We wrote, newspapers are still different. I still think newspapers give you a lot more of what you need as a voter about policies, about substance, going deep on subjects, giving you, almost university level, not as good as Princeton, but, descriptions of issues that you should care about. And they're just not the things that people click on. We're giving it to you. We're giving it, not to you, we're giving it to people. And if you look at the most clicked, it's the cat video, even on our site. And they go for the more buzzy stories. So part of our challenge is to find a way to tell these stories in ways that will seem buzzy, but get people educated and informed.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. There's a lot of conversation happening around just the ways that the consolidation of media is contributing to what you discussed. So I wonder, in some respects, if the answer lies in the decentralization of media, right, in terms of making this kind of coverage more palatable.
Well, but see, I think we actually experience a fragmentation of media, because in fact there are so many more sources these days to go for if you want information. Now, broadly, I think that's a good thing, right? We have a robust, powerful marketplace of ideas. Any other country in the world should be jealous of the variety and diversity and intensity of the sources of information that we have in this country. If you want to know about something, there's every place in the world you can go to get it. And the problem is that because it's gotten like it was in the turn of the century, last century. We used to have newspapers, 5 newspapers in a city, right? But they were all ideological. They were yellow press. This one is the conservative one, this is the liberal one, this is the socialist one, this one's the libertarian one. And they're overtly opinionated, they didn't try to be unbiased or objective the way at least we try to be these days. So we've returned to that era, but we've returned to it with a vengeance, in which is powered by these great engines of social media that just drown out everything. And so people don't read the New York Times anymore. They read Twitter, and sometimes they go to the New York Times because Twitter takes them there. Our homepage, right? Forget the print paper, I'm an old fart, I read the print paper. Even the homepage is an old fart thing. People do not read the homepage anymore. Our homepage traffic has just completely collapsed. That's not how people get their information these days. They get on their phones, right? I assume you get maybe some of your information on your phone. And this has meant that we don't have a single destination where we all go to for news. And that's why we do kind of come at it from different factual starting points.
Hi, I don't know if you've seen, I'm Bobo, I'm a sophomore. I don't know if you've seen this, but Fox News posted an article about 3 hours ago titled Bias Alert, and it's about you, about how much you're biased. And they end, they end the article, with a question of the New York Times did not respond when Fox News asked if Baker is still considered a straight news reporter. So, are you?
Okay, good question. Good. Well, I haven't seen that. So I can't say I don't know what it said. I did get an email from a person from Fox who asked me my opinion on this question, and I sent him my answer. So I don't know if he quoted it or not. He was focused on an article I wrote in today's paper, a news analysis. And the news analysis was about Trump the divider, not the uniter. It's kind of what we were just talking about. Playing off of this weekend in the NFL and Steph Curry and so many other things that he goes after. And my point to them is that there is a difference between analysis and opinion. And I think what I do is give analysis that is based on a factual set of observations. And observations that are rooted in 30 years of being a journalist and 20 years of covering the White House. So I've covered 4 presidents now. And I can say, I think, with some degree of authority, that what this president is choosing to do is different than what his predecessors did. And that's not opinion. That is analysis. Now, okay, they don't like it. Fair enough. That's their right to write it, and I support them. I'm glad they reached out to me and asked me my view before they publish it. I give them credit for that, and I'm more than happy for us to take the hit if they want to take a hit. We ourselves, as reporters, ought to be able to stand up to scrutiny the same way we scrutinize other institutions of major American life, right? We dish it out. We got to be able to take it. So I've got no problem if people want to write and criticize my work, as long as it's accurate, factually accurate, and that's fair. And again, I hope they will call me first and let me have a chance to give my point of view. So, but thanks for pointing it out.
Hi, my name's Himani, and I'm an undergraduate here. I read The Audacity of Hope this summer, and Barack Obama talked about how he thinks that the U.S. became much more polarized in the 70s and the 80s because of the coincident timing of the economic depression as well as the LGBTQ movement and the civil rights movement. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on why the U.S. has become so much more polarized than other democratic countries.
Why we become more polarized than other democratic countries? It's a good question, and I wrestle with this because obviously it feels that way, right? And there are indices we can point to that would seem to indicate that. The disparity between Republican approval and Democratic approval of our presidents, for instance, is the highest level it's been in the time they've measured it, for instance. So Barack Obama had, as of 2015, the top 10 years in which a president was viewed radically differently between his party and the other party in polls. He had 6 of those top 10 years, and George W. Bush had 4 of those top 10 years. So there was the last 2 presidents were major gaps in the way we saw them. 70 percentage points between how Republicans and Democrats judged those 2 presidencies. So there's no question you could find elements that talk about polarization. And I do think that social media has provided a bullhorn to the louder elements of our society that probably give the impression of being in some ways even more polarized than maybe we really are. I think we can have a civilized conversation and disagree. And I think the vast majority of people I meet, I can still have those conversations with, or I watch them have conversations with others. But the people who used to mostly be invisible in our society on the fringes now have a much more visible, easy method of getting their views out. What used to take, I get hundreds, thousands of Twitter posts or whatever complaining about this or that or the other thing. In the old days, those people had to find a piece of paper, get an envelope, write it down, find an address, get a stamp, walk to the mailbox before they sent me their death threat. Now it takes nothing, boom, it's right out there. So I do think that we've empowered elements of society that have probably always been there, at least to some degree. And that, I think, has encouraged a growth of that. Having said all that, I do worry that we overstate it as well. I mean, this is politics has always been rough in this country. If you go back to the beginning, if you go back to Jefferson and Adams, my God, the newspapers that were working for either side were calling each other. Lincoln was called a monkey. People were beating each other on the floor of the Senate with a cane. Politics ain't beanbag, and it's been tough before. We had, in our lifetime or the lifetime of your parents, we had the McCarthy era, we had Vietnam, we had the Civil Rights era, we had Watergate. These were very polarized, divisive times. Now, in some ways, they were not divisive as much along party lines as they are today. Because in, say, the 60s, when Lyndon Johnson was doing the Civil Rights Act, he was working with Republicans as much as he was working with Northern Democrats, while it was Southern Democrats who were opposed. So what's happened in the 20, 30, 40 years since then is people have migrated to their ideological homes, right? So if you're liberal, you're no longer in the Republican Party, even if you're in New England. And if you're conservative, you're no longer in the Democratic Party, even if you're from Mississippi. People have migrated to their homes. The parties are as calcified in their philosophical views as they've ever been. But I think we've always had, a certain degree of polarization. We in fact built it into the system. We created 3 branches of government, one of them 2 houses of Congress, because we wanted us to fight. We wanted us to fight about big things, and eventually the winner of those ideas, the best ideas, would rise to the surface. Now you could say that's just led to absolute paralysis in this time, and that's a fair point. And we have to look at those. What's behind that? Is that gerrymandering of House districts, where people are much more worried about being primaried from the right or the left than they are about being defeated by the other party? That pulls you more toward your ideological, extreme than if you're worried about having to reach out to the middle, which is what we had to do. No question that plays a role. Are there other aspects of our rules, for instance, the filibuster rule, or the ways the Congress works, or the way the judiciary has inserted itself? All these things are fair points, but I think that we're just in a different era, and it doesn't mean it's going to last, but it's built at all these things we've just talked about. I'm talking too long.
Hi, my name's Elliot. I'm a sophomore here at Princeton, and I'm an international student. For as long as I can remember, back home, my parents ordered the international edition of your newspaper, the former Herald Tribune. And one thing that stunned me since coming here was just how much the domestic version of the Times talks about Donald Trump. I did a Command F of your website just now, and his name comes up 28 times on the front page. My question is, do you think at a certain point the American public, your readers, will have kind of Trump fatigue? Is there a certain point at which we read too much about him?
I don't know about them, but I can tell you about me.
And on that, what effect do you think that'll have on people's attention to the administration, resistance, et cetera?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. You're right. I mean, Trump, he attacks the fake media. He has been the best thing for the media in a long time. Our readership is huge. It's huge. Believe me. No, seriously, it's gone way up. We're now at 3 million paid digital and print subscribers. That's the high. We have more people. I've forgotten the number, but we've got more people reading us, even the people who don't pay, than we've ever had in the history of the New York Times. And we're not the only ones. The Washington Post is way up. CNN and Fox and MSNBC. I think Fox actually is having trouble, but I don't say that anyway. I just think actually it's funny that this environment has been tougher on them. But CNN's way up and MSNBC is way up. I think there's such a voracious appetite right now for all things Trump. Now, that may or may not necessarily always produce great journalism, right? We don't want to be the Trump Times. We have a lot of things we want to cover in the world today. But if you look at our most viewed and our most emailed and our most clicked on stories, they tend to be about Trump, and the traffic is tremendous. So we are trying to find a way to satisfy that appetite with good journalism, the journalism that matters. And that's not just the easy, Melania's wearing stiletto heels to a hurricane stories, although we're going to do that. We're not above that. But with stories about, what about Trump's business? What about, North Korea policy? What about serious big issues here? What about the Russia investigation? We've broken a lot of stories, I think, this year in what's turned out to be a pretty good old-fashioned newspaper war with the Washington Post on what happened with the Russia situation last year. And I think those are important. But I think there will come a time when the interest will have to begin to diminish. But listen, this guy, he's good at keeping cliffhangers, right? He's good at changing the storyline, changing the narrative. The ratings are good. He talked about it. Sean Spicer, his ratings are good. Sean's ratings go down, he's gone. He wants there to be a lot of people reading about him. He wants there to be a lot of people watching him. He is a ratings machine. And so it will be a while, I think, before he runs out of things to do or say that shock us and get people's attention. But for the moment, he hasn't yet run out. So I hope that helps.
Hi, I'm Alexandra. I'm an undergraduate student here, and I was wondering, kind of like as you mentioned before, that people are kind of turning to social media to like get their news, and seeing as kind of Trump is also kind of directly giving his opinion straight to people through social media. Do you feel like this is a permanent trend in the future, like that they're kind of wiggling around the traditional media to go to social media?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. In fact, I mean, Trump is not the first to do it, of course. I mean, Obama did this. Obama used social media to great effect to get around us. He had his own videos on the website. He would talk with Jake, whose last name I can't pronounce, between the ferns, and he would go on YouTube channels with the woman with the green lipstick and the bathtub full of Cheerios, and he would, he did a lot of things that moved beyond traditional media. So, Trump has mastered it in the sense of Twitter, right? He has the highest Twitter following of anybody, I'm sure he'll tell you. But he's not the first. He's just the extension of that trend, which has been growing. And yeah, I think it's going to continue. And I don't really actually have a problem with that. And I know a lot of my colleagues, fellow reporters, get upset at the White House trying to, bypass us or whatever. You know what? I don't mind. Presidents ought to be able to communicate however they want to communicate with the public. That's their right, and it's the public's right to hear them. And it's our right and our job to continue to cover them in a thorough, fair, but tough way. And I think that there's, as much as people are going to go to Trump's or any president's Twitter feed or website or whatever, they still need, and I still think they want, independent media that's going to tell them things that any president, not just this one, don't want them to know. So I think I'm okay with that part of it. I'm okay with that part.
Hi, I'm Alia. I'm a sophomore in the economics department. So after the election, the New York Times received a lot of criticism for its coverage of the election because people felt that it unfairly equated Hillary's email scandal with Trump's various scandals throughout his campaign.
Have you been reading What Happened? What Happened?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. So do you think
Hillary's book.
Do you think that the New York Times coverage of the campaign was truly balanced? And knowing the outcome of the election now, do you think the Times should have changed its approach to election coverage?
That's a great question, and it's one we get asked a lot. And I'm gonna start with a complete and total punt by saying I wasn't involved with the election coverage, so I don't have the best answer for you in that sense. But I think, look, we always look back at our coverage and try to evaluate where did things go right and where did they go wrong. What can we learn from any period of coverage? And that's how we get better. If we didn't do that, we would not be, a healthy, vibrant industry. Do I think we overplayed some issues, underplayed others? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I have to say, I was, are we tweeting today? I have to say that the email issue didn't interest me nearly as much as the foundation interested. I thought we may have probably could have done some more about the Clinton Foundation. When the Saudis give the Clinton Foundation $25 million, it's probably not out of the goodness of their hearts, probably because they thought that person was going to be the president of the United States and it might be worth giving money. And I think that's an issue that we should have probably explored a little bit more. But did we not explore all the different things that were of importance to know about Trump? I think we did. I think we did at great length and at great, extent. I mean, we told people everything they needed to know about him to the extent that we could learn it, about his business practices, about his history, about whether it be women, about whether it be, the 3,000 lawsuits against him from vendors or whatever. I think if you go back and look at the coverage, we gave as much information as any paper could give about any major party candidate. Now the difference is that with Hillary Clinton, there was an FBI investigation that focused on one issue, which is the email thing, and so that created a storyline that commanded more attention on her side of the equation. With him, there were so many different issues to explore, that no one of them sort of became like a running story day in, day out, right? Because we did Trump University today, and tomorrow we did, some other, investigative piece that we thought people should know about. And the next day, another one. So if you add it all up, there's a whole lot of things that they wrote about, our investigative reporters wrote about. But it wasn't the same thing day after day after day after day. So I know Hillary Clinton's upset at the New York Times, and she's got a whole chapter telling you why we're terrible, and that's fine. That's fair. We're big boys and girls and can stand up to scrutiny. But, one of the things that she complained about to us was a story that said that the FBI had been asked to investigate, and she said that wasn't true, and it actually was. Her people tried to squirm around that with some sort of hair-splitting definitional thing, saying it's not really an investigation, it's an inquiry, all this kind of stuff. It was an investigation, and we know that because, in fact, the FBI director came out and told us eventually it was. So they wanted to minimize what was going on. I get it, but that's not our job, is to worry about what's going to help or hurt her. That's not our job. Our job is to try to cover it as best we can. And I think we gave people the context that they needed. We obviously would like to know other things. We would like to know more about what happened with Russia before the election. Our reporters, dug and dug and dug and got what they could, and they're continuing to dig and dig and dig. In the end, we don't have subpoena power. In the end, we can do the best we can, and we will continue to do what we can.
So for those people who are at the mics, we will get your questions in, but then after that, just to protect, Peter will go until whenever, but to protect him from himself, those at the mics will get their questions, and after that, we're going to have to cut it off. But Peter will be outside signing books and is glad to talk to people.
Great.
We just have to have some mercy on him. Thank you for your forbearance. Yes.
Hi, I'm Akash. I'm a freshman at the university. So a lot of people were discussing this beforehand, and you were kind of alluding to it too. We're seeing nowadays, especially around the 2016 election, somewhat increased polarization on different sides, and at least I think to an extent, a lot of this can be attributed to social media in personalization algorithms that are perhaps showing individuals views that they already agree with and are not showing them different views. So as an objective site and a news media organization that touts objectivity and praises objectivity, how do you think the New York Times is going to respond to individuals in the future, perhaps turning to more ideologically oriented sites? And what do you think the future of journalism for objective media in general will look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question. I'll start by saying this, that, we use the word objective. It's not a good word because, there is no such thing as objective, right? We're all human beings. Everybody's got their perspective, and but it is what we aspire to. I compare it to trying to, nobody is sin-free, but we try to live a sin-free life. We try to be better people. Journalists cannot possibly ever be totally objective, but we try. And I think there's a great marketplace for that. I think that our goal as a business and as a journalism mission ought to be to fill that space between all those ideological and sometimes questionable news outlets, so that if you don't really know whether to believe this strange story that came up on your Facebook feed, you can go to the New York Times because you know that we'll give you the straight story as best we can, and that when we give it to you, hopefully, at the very least, it's well reported and based on facts, and that you could then evaluate it how you choose to. I think brand name matters in that sense. That not all sources on the internet are not equal, and that so. To do that, we need to be very careful about preserving our brand, but preserving our integrity, preserving our franchise, doing the best we can to give you the best journalism we can. And when we screw up, tell you we screwed up. We have a robust corrections policy at our paper. When we make mistakes, we correct them. And believe me, sometimes we correct things I think are stupid and shouldn't be corrected because they weren't wrong in the first place. But they're very aggressive about that because they care very much about maintaining our integrity with you, the reader. So yes, there's going to be people flocking to, left-wing, right-wing, pro-this, anti-that kind of sites. And my view is, okay, great. When you're done with that, come back to us, and we'll help you sort through it, because that's our role. So.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a freshman here. In regards to the 98% statistic you said about urban and rural voters, if either major party were to run a candidate like Bernie Sanders, in the sense that he breaks from the party center and has the ability to appeal to more rural voters than a typical Democrat, Republicans run a candidate that appeals to more urban voters, would we see that statistic significantly drop, or are those voters too closely tied to party affiliation?
That's a great question, and I don't, I'm not sure I know the answer. I'm struck by how much people are voting in tribes more than on even ideology. People sometimes vote against their own, what you would think would be their philosophical interest, because they're voting in tribes, and so can somebody break through that? Can somebody cross those geographic and ideological lines in the country today? It's possible. Everything. I think we should learn. One thing we should learn after last year's election is to be humble and realize that everything is possible in this country. And all of those reporters, including myself, who said certain things were not possible, should stop making predictions. But it's hard. It's just hard. The system, the structure now is structurally set up to encourage this and that, and to fit into that mold, that prism that we've been talking about. You mentioned Bernie. I think we have spent so much time talking about President Trump and the Republicans that one of the things that's really been missing in our coverage is just how big a moment this is for the Democrats to figure out who they are, right? What do they stand for? Where are they going to be? Are they going to be Bernie? Are they going to be, Elizabeth Warren? Are they going to be, Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton? What is the future of the Democratic Party? And it's been papered over to some extent, this big schism going on right now inside their party because things are so, volatile and so many fireworks on the other side of the aisle. But the Democrats have a big, big challenge in front of them if they want to kind of get back on their feet. They don't have a natural leader at this point. Bernie may run again, but Joe Biden may run again. But at some point, they're going to have to move on to another generation. And they don't have somebody seemingly waiting in the wings. They don't seem to have a Barack Obama who came out of nowhere, who's ready and an obvious choice. Now, that may happen. We've got time. But that's a debate I wish we were covering a little bit more because I think that the Democrats haven't fully grappled either. Being anti-Trump party is satisfying to the base, but it doesn't necessarily actually win you elections, we've discovered.
Hi, I'm Joelle. I'm a first-year master's student here. I wanted to talk about the office of the presidency a little bit more. I think Americans look to the president not just for political and policy leadership, but also moral leadership. And given that this current president has made some serious moral failings both in public and has been accused of them over the years and yet has shown no remorse, I'm wondering about your reflections on what that would do to the integrity of the office in the eyes of the American public.
Well, that's a great question. It really is. I do think that, how to answer that? I get asked this question all the time, like, is this permanent, right? Are we always now going to have people in the highest office who flout what have traditionally been the standards or the norms as we have expected them to be in the presidency? And I think the answer is no. I think that this guy, this president, is really, really sui generis. I think that he is popular with his supporters because he is who he is. I don't think other people can pretend to be him. He did a remarkable thing. He did a remarkably. This is a New York billionaire who somehow captured the populist movement of the country. Right? How does that work? The guy's got gold, fixtures in his private plane in his tower in New York, and he's talking about going after elites and the system. It worked for him. When other politicians have tried it, it didn't work for them, right? For whatever reason, we see it, people who like him at least see it as being authentic with him, in the sense that that is who he is. When Marco Rubio decided to try to give him a little bit of this for that in the primaries last year, he discovered it didn't work because it wasn't natural, and you can't just sort of become something that you're not. Politicians are who they are. And I think the next president is, so Trump has a lot of support among people who are really happy that he's giving it to the system. And that's interesting and important and something we ought to know about our system. But I think that the next president is going to be a reaction to that. And the next president is going, whether Republican or Democrat, there's going to be an incentive structure to be the anti-Trump, right? To show we are going to do things the way we used to do them, that we're going to comport ourselves in a different way, that we're not going to, stir the pot maybe the way he did. We're going to, do this and that. Because that's what we do. We tend to, David Axelrod, who was President Obama's strategist, said we vote for a remedy, not a replica. The next president we vote for is often opposite of the one we just finished with, because we're tired of that one, right? George W. Bush led to Barack Obama. Obama was the opposite of George W. Bush in many ways. He certainly positioned himself that way. And Donald Trump couldn't be more opposite than Barack Obama, right? So I think under that theory of politics, at least, the next one we'll be looking for, whether it be 4 years or 8 years, would presumably be somebody who would be the opposite of what we've got now, in terms of at least deportment and so forth, not necessarily ideology. So I don't think this is a permanent change. I think that he has been rewarded for a style of leadership that would not have been rewarded in the political system in the past, one that has, where divisiveness has become, in fact, much more overtly used as a tool of political gain and leadership. But I do think that there's, if you look around right now, there's not a lot of people in Washington who are trying to be like him, because they couldn't get away with it. They couldn't get away with it. I mean, it's just not, the incentive structure is still not going to reward people who color outside the lines that radically in all the different positions that we elect and so forth. So I think this is a phenomenon of the moment. He is a sui generis character who has done very well by being who he is, and that has appealed to people who voted for him. But that does not mean it's changed the system, I think. All right.